Welcome to episode 32 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. On this edition of the podcast, we're going to give a different perspective on the Carson Wentz controversial story that was in PhillyVoice.com. Also, a review of the latest Shazam trailer and what it means for the DC movie universe moving forward. Some perspective on the UFC's debut on ESPN, how well it did numbers-wise, and the value of bringing the UFC now for ESPN and MMA as a whole. And finally, we'll do a recap of the comic book movies that are coming out in 2019 and why you should or shouldn't be watching them this upcoming year. So let's open a cold one and get started on episode 32 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Topic number one on the podcast, I want to touch on the controversial Carson Wentz story that came out this week. Now, I'm not going to come on here and give you some bull questioning the authenticity of the quotes or questioning who said what or the validity of the author or the website. I'm not gonna be that guy. I have no interest in being that person. But I do want to take the time here to have a conversation about why this article happened, okay? Because so many times in life, everyone just reacts. Nobody actually thinks about the why and the what behind what happens many times in life. And a little of this is going to be a little bit psychoanalytical. A little of this is going to be, maybe a little deeper than the typical sports conversation. But I think it's an aspect of the story that needs to be had on some level. So let's do a quick synopsis of Carson Wentz. The Philadelphia Eagles traded not once, but twice up to get him. Carson Wentz was supposed to redshirt his rookie year, is what they told us. But then about 8 days before the start of the regular season, they trade away Sam Bradford. They trade away the presumed starting quarterback, thrusting Carson Wentz into the limelight. He goes 3-0 in his first 3 starts. 5 touchdowns, no interceptions. Everyone's like, man, that pick looked great. Then the next 10 games, no Lane Johnson. He was suspended. The team only wins 2 of their next 10 games. Carson Wentz finishes the season in the final 13 games. He only had 11 touchdowns, and he had 14 interceptions. He also played with statistically the worst receiving core in the NFL. The Philadelphia Eagles receivers were among the worst in the NFL in drops per target, in total drops, and in catch per target percentage. They were just not good. So what did the Eagles do? They had Alshon Jeffrey. They add Torrey Smith. They're trying to upgrade the team around Wentz. Wentz has a full offseason with the team, brings the receivers out to him to train together. What happens? Record-breaking season. Breaks the Eagles' single-season record for touchdowns in just 13 games. But in that final game in Los Angeles, he tears his ACL and LCL. Done for the year. What happens? Nick Foles takes the team that Carson Wentz put in position to be as successful as they were and wins the Super Bowl. Carson Wentz works his tail off to come back, be the starting quarterback. In 9 months, he is back on the field in week 3, starting for the Eagles. A crazy time to come back. 9 months from tearing not 1 but 2 ligaments in his knee. Even when he comes back, he never looks 100% for an entire game. He has his moments, his highs, his lows, but he still throws 21 touchdowns, 7 interceptions in 11 games. Then we find out after the overtime loss to the Cowboys, Carson Wentz has a stress fracture in his back. They never officially rule him out for the year, but every doctor agreed that he wasn't going to come back anytime soon with that issue in his back. Nick Foles goes on, leads the team to another playoff berth. They lose in the divisional round. And then the controversy gets even hotter. Who should be the starting quarterback moving forward? Is it the guy the Eagles trade up twice to get Wentz, the guy that the whole league agrees is one of the great young quarterbacks and one of the great quarterback prospects in the league? The guy that Adam Schefter, ESPN NFL Insider, claims that NFL teams would give up multiple first-round picks and potentially potentially anybody on a roster for this guy? Or are you going to keep the Super Bowl darling, the guy who got to the Super Bowl, the guy who has Super Bowl MVP? And then there were accusations that Carson Wentz was going too much to Zach Ertz. That Nick Foles spread the ball around more, even though Carson Wentz had fewer turnovers in 11 starts than Nick Foles in his 7 starts. 5 regular season, 2 postseason. Nick Foles actually finished the postseason in his 2 postseason starts. Yeah, he won 1, lost 1, but he also had 4 interceptions. Carson Wentz had 7 interceptions in 11 games. Under Foles and Wentz, the team still averaged 22 points per game. But perception is reality. We are all prisoners of the moment. Everyone is so hung up on what have you done for me lately instead of what can you do for me moving forward. And then the Philly Voice article comes out a week after the end of the Eagles season, calling Carson Wentz selfish, egotistical, uncompromising, claiming that Wentz was never the same guy this year as he was last year. That guys were hoping he would be the same guy he was before next year, but Carson Wentz had bullied offensive coordinator Mike Groh. And there's all kinds of other accusations made in the article that, as far as I'm concerned, was unnecessary. It comes off as guys with agendas, maybe guys who are hoping to make more money when they come up in free agency, are mad because they didn't get the amount of passes and the amount of targets that other guys did. I want to remind you who Carson Wentz is. Carson Wentz is a young man, and to me, anybody under 30 is still a young man, who grew up in a world that is very different than most professional athletes. When you look around the Eagles roster, Lane Johnson, Jason Peters, on the defense, Fletcher Cox, Malcolm Jenkins, wide receivers like Alshon Jeffrey, a tight end, and Zach Ertz. Up and down this entire roster, there are players who have gone through the traditional life cycle. As we grow up, you go to high school, you're exposed to all new kinds of people and cultures and attitudes of life. College is another open door to introduce to even a wider range of people and cultures and life around you. Then when you get to your first professional career level, it's a whole nother experience and learning how to deal with people from different cultures and different backgrounds. Carson Wentz is nothing like these other athletes. I'm not trying to accuse Carson Wentz of being sheltered, but his environmental exposure was extremely limited. Carson Wentz has admitted this, and others have admitted this about him. He loves football, and he loves his faith, and those are the 2 biggest things in his life, and there's barely any room for anything else. The fact that he's even married might surprise some people, because it was the same fiancée before they got married who said that she had to tell Carson to stop watching game tape under the table when they were out at dinner. Carson Wentz, a well-publicized, professing born-again Christian, he is very vocal about his faith and his love for football, because that's all he ever grew up knowing. Those were his driving forces in his life. He went to high school and the college in the same state, North Dakota. He didn't grow up in a melting pot of America. He didn't grow up in a cultural diverse world. He didn't grow up in an environment where he knew people from multiple different backgrounds. He grew up in a part of the country that many of you listening to my voice have zero or very little experience to identify with. A lot of farmland, a lot of isolation. People are known to be hardworking, good people, salt of the earth. So Carson Wentz went from high school to college, 2 levels of life that a young man is supposed to be starting to be introduced to different people of different cultures, backgrounds, environments, and ways of thinking. He didn't even get exposed to that much. All he's ever known are certain ways of thinking, certain attitudes, certain ways of treating football, certain ways of looking at one's faith, certain ways of treating other people. His first exposure to life outside of the Midwest of the United States was when his football team traveled to other parts of the country. So you're talking about a young man. It takes him until his 20s, until he's introduced to genuine city life, to people from environments that are nothing like the Midwest. They don't look at football. They don't look at faith. They don't look at each other the same way that Carson Wentz has. So when Carson Wentz says the things he says, acts the way he acts, it can be misunderstood. It can be misinterpreted. Because the people in the NFL are not all alike. The NFL, like most professional sports leagues, is a melting pot of people from multiple different backgrounds and cultures and experiences and lifestyles. Not everyone looks at football the same way Carson Wentz does. There are people in the NFL who don't love football. They love what football does for their bank account, for their lifestyle. There are people that say that they love God, but they don't look at God and look at the Bible the same way Carson Wentz does. There are people in the NFL who say that they love their spouse, they love their girlfriend, but they don't treat that person or care about that person the same way Carson Wentz would. There are people in the NFL who come from poverty, who come from rough backgrounds, who come from different lifestyles and different cultures that Carson Wentz couldn't identify with, even if he went through a college course explaining to him those lifestyles and those cultures and those experiences. He still wouldn't be able to fully grasp and understand it. It's not that Carson Wentz is egotistical. It's not that Carson Wentz is selfish. It's not that Carson Wentz is any of these things that he's been described as. Those are descriptions by people who do not fully understand him about a person who doesn't fully understand them. The bottom line is this article only is a microcosm of what is wrong with society today. Nobody talks to each other anymore. Instead of these players getting together and sitting down with Carson Wentz or sitting down with Doug Peterson or talking to somebody else within the locker room or the organization about their issues with Carson Wentz, they go to a reporter. The people who are the anonymous sources in this article are no better or are no different than the same people that you and I see every day who vent their lives on Facebook, on Twitter, on Snapchat, on Instagram. It's the same mentality. People can't talk to each other anymore. They have to talk about their life, their problems, their emotional state, everything that's going on with them, and they got to put it on full blast for other people to see. They talk about other people behind their back instead of talking to that person. There is a strong level of dysfunction in today's world, and this Carson Wentz story is a perfect picture of it. These athletes won't talk to Carson, but they'll talk to a member of the media about their issues with Carson. For everyone who has something good to say about Carson Wentz, the people who come out on Twitter, the members of the media, the people defending him on multiple different levels, the great difference between those people and the people in the story is that those people have a better functional relationship with Carson Wentz than the anonymous sources talking about Wentz. This story was nothing more than an opportunity for somebody to put out one side of a story. Alan Dershowitz, the famous lawyer who worked on the O.J. Simpson case, who's written numerous books, controversial, but he made a great point years ago in one of his books. He said there are facts and then there are true facts. There are the facts that people find to support their point of view on a topic or an individual or a subject. And then there are true facts, the information that is gathered to develop a specific opinion or perspective on a topic or person or subject. We have to be careful that we're not just running with information without understanding the why behind it. Why are these people calling Carson Wentz these names? Do they have an agenda? Do they have a personal problem with Carson Wentz? Are they frustrated with him? Do they feel they can't speak to him? Do they feel that they are not allowed to speak their mind? Have they tried to talk to him? Have they tried to talk to the coaches? Have they gone to Doug Peterson? All this article has done is created more questions than answers. At the end of the day, if Carson Wentz comes back next year, has another MVP caliber season, and the Eagles make the postseason, this article is going to be history. But on the flip side, if Carson Wentz has any issue this upcoming season, if the team struggles, everyone's just going to point to that article and shake their fist in the air and say, see, I told you so. This all could have been avoided. The name calling, the perception, the attitudes. If people would just talk to each other instead of anonymously talking to people in the media. You are not making your situation better by putting your life on blast on social media or anonymously as a tip to a reporter on ESPN or Fox Sports or any other media platform. All you're doing is avoiding fixing the problem. And as far as I'm concerned, the people who complained about Wentz in this article were not interested in fixing their relationship with Carson or improving the situation for Carson or putting them and Carson in a better working situation. They were just interested in venting and being heard. Just because you feel a certain way or think a certain way doesn't mean that there isn't more to it than just how you're thinking and how you're feeling. And as a result, Carson Wentz and the Philadelphia Eagles are still under a hot spotlight, leaving us with more questions than answers at the end of the day because of this story. Topic number 2 on this edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast, the latest trailer for the movie Shazam, which comes out April 5th, is the next DC movie, and the significance of this movie isn't as much the specific character or the story, but it's the next step in DC Comics and Warner Brothers' move away from the more dark and gritty and overly serious movies that they've been doing with Batman v Superman and Justice League to try to show the lighter side of DC Comics. Remember, last year they fired many people who were executives. Jeff Johns even stepped down from his position, opening the opportunity for new directors and new voices and new ideas to come into the DC universe in terms of their movies. Now, remember, DC has been very successful when it comes to their television shows on the CW, and the CW has been allowed a lot of liberty, as well as Gotham on Fox, with these characters and their portrayals. Some people accuse them of having too much liberty. That's a conversation for another day. But what I want to focus on more so is how this movie is specifically the next step in DC building a new look at their universe. The tagline of the trailer for Shazam, the new one, says, "He's not so serious." And that's very significant to point out because Shazam was a character that was originally created to be more kid-friendly than Superman was in the 1940s and the 1950s. Now, there was a time Shazam, who was originally known as Captain Marvel, because he displayed the many marvelous powers and abilities of different Greek entities. For example, Achilles and Zeus, and he has the wisdom of Solomon. He's got all these abilities, and so he's got all these different marvels that he has a part of his character. And the great thing about the movie is that it takes a character that was meant to be a little bit more lighthearted. A character is meant to be more of a fictitious character than based in reality. Remember, I explained to you before, Stan Lee tried to create characters who were less characters you idolize and more characters you can identify with. Characters whose powers and abilities could be based in reality and science. Shazam is a character that's not based in reality or science. It's magic. It's mystical powers. So you're bringing a character like that to the movie screen. You can't take it too seriously. Just like I've explained about characters before. When you have a character, let's say Billy Batson's about 12, 14 years old. He becomes a superhero. He doesn't know how to be a superhero. He doesn't know how to use his powers. All he knows is he has these abilities now whenever he wants to tap into them. And the movie is about the story of how he becomes this hero, how he deals with being the hero, and the responsibilities that come with being a hero as well. I'm looking forward to this movie because it's finally DC opening up a side of them that Marvel was much more willing to open up at first. See, Marvel said, look, we know that our characters are fictional comics. These are not overly serious characters. They have serious things they deal with, but the characters themselves are not dark. And every character does not have to be Batman. Every character does not have to be dark and brooding. Shazam was meant to be more lighthearted. And Shazam can be to the DC universe what Ant-Man is to the Marvel universe. A character who's an outsider with a unique skill set with no real background in how to be the hero they are. Think about all the other superheroes in comics. Batman is a billionaire. Superman grew up with his powers his whole life on Earth, and he's basically invincible. You go to the Marvel Universe, Tony Stark, billionaire, super genius scientist. Black Panther, trained to be a warrior, superior intellect. Captain America, soldier, tough, knows how to fight. What on earth does a 12 or 14-year-old kid know about being a superhero? Except for what they've read in a comic or seen on a TV show. They don't know anything. And the same thing with Ant-Man. When Ant-Man gets his opportunity to be the Ant-Man, he doesn't really know what he's doing. He doesn't know about Pym particles. He doesn't know about shrinking and expansion and the microverse and the quantum realm. He doesn't know any of that stuff. So this is an opportunity for DC to have a little fun, open up the door to have more humor, to be less serious, but still tell a great story. And I'm really looking forward to this movie. And I think you should go watch when it comes out April 5th. It basically falls right in between when Avengers Endgame and Captain Marvel, the two big Marvel movies, are coming out. This DC movie is kind of sandwiched in between. So for some people, they may feel like it's superhero overkill, but don't go into it looking at just purely a superhero film. Go into it looking into it as more as a movie to go, have some fun, and enjoy yourself. Topic number 3 on the Mutant Blitz Podcast. The UFC made their debut on ESPN and ESPN Plus in a big-time manner. Record-setting night, not just for the UFC, but for ESPN. ESPN Plus services signed up over 568,000 subscribers just Friday and Saturday for these fights. The 1.4 television rating is the largest UFC prelims fight card on cable since 2013. The main event, Cejudo versus Dillashaw, ended up being a phenomenal finish. The whole card from top to bottom was entertaining. It was fun to watch. And it was a great opportunity for the UFC to not just debut to the world, but show everyone who had questions, is this worth our time, worth our subscription, worth our eyeballs, that it is definitely worth their attention and worth their eyeballs. And this is a win-win for everybody involved, the UFC being on ESPN. And I want to give a moment to explain how far we've come. What you know as mixed martial arts and the UFC has really only been around for about 20 years. When the UFC was first founded in the early 1990s, it was not sports. It was not mixed martial arts. It was sold as a competition to see who the greatest fighter was. It wasn't regulated. There were almost no rules. It was just a bunch of dudes from multiple backgrounds coming into a cage and fighting each other. Secretly, the UFC was a proxy for the Gracie family, the founders of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu almost 100 years ago, for them to put one of their own in front of the world as basically a propaganda tool for them to promote Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And while it worked, it opened up the doors for an entirely new breed of athlete to come along for the next 30 years. But at the time, it was all about fighting, it was all about violence, and it was all about promotion. As the UFC evolved, they realized that if they're going to keep people watching, they need to have higher stakes, and not just financial stakes. They wanted to have belts. They wanted to have championships. They wanted to have guys fighting for those championships. They wanted to draw more and more fighters to the organization. The UFC was sold to the Fertitta brothers and the Dana White. And when they took over, they wanted to make the sport more mainstream. And they wanted to regulate it. They wanted to have weight classes and regulations and drug testing and all the things that go along with regular sports. So when The Ultimate Fighter eventually came along and they were putting on these fights on television, the idea was that they were trying to open the world up to these athletes. And part of the sales pitch of mixed martial arts with the UFC at the time was, our champion is the best fighter in the world. And our fighters are the most talented, the hardest working, and the best fighters on the planet. And it was a sales pitch that worked for a very long time as the organization and mixed martial arts grew. And as other organizations crumbled and other ones built themselves up, Pride in Japan fell apart. A lot of those fighters went to either the UFC or to Elite XC, which evolved in the Strike Force. Bellator came along. All these different organizations were popping up and bringing up more fighters and more weight classes and more opportunities for people with martial art backgrounds or wrestling backgrounds or a variety of different athletic disciplines that come into the mixed martial arts world and compete. So by the time the UFC had signed their big contract with Fox, they had built up this brand, this image, that they were the best MMA promotion on the planet. But in order to make themselves mainstream, they had to change their strategy when it came to promotion. Because part of the deal with Fox was, we are going to have X number of events every year. The UFC exponentially expanded its fight calendar. The whole game had changed due to one contract, due to one agreement. Because no longer was every UFC pay-per-view the must-watch fight of the month. No longer was every championship fight the headliner of the card. Now the headliner could be just a great fight that maybe was only the second or third fight on an older UFC pay-per-view card. You were exposing more and more fighters to the limelight who weren't there before. And then the UFC had to explain to people that their sport, in its presentation and its schedule, was less like boxing and more like the NBA and the NHL and the NFL. Here's why. A regular season NBA game is different than the Eastern Conference Finals. Game 7 of the first round of the playoffs in the NHL is nothing like Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals. Week 4 in the NFL is not the same of level and intensity and value as the conference championships going to overtime. Not every team in the NFL has Tom Brady. Not every team in the NBA has a superstar like LeBron James. These were all aspects that had to be now introduced to the casual and intermediate MMA fan. While the hardcore fan understood that Chris Lytle is an exciting fighter, Donald Cerrone is an incredible fighter to watch, most fans, all they knew was Chuck Liddell was a champion, John Jones is a champion, Brock Lesnar is a beast, I like this guy, I don't like this guy. The casual fan didn't have the amount of exposure and knowledge of the sport that others did. So now the UFC is having to change their entire branding, their entire promotion setup to help you understand that the UFC Fight Night that used to be on Fox and FS1 and FS2 and Fox Television, the fight nights were not the biggest events. It's like with golf or NASCAR. Not every NASCAR race is the Daytona 500. Not every golf tournament is the Masters. Not every tennis tournament is Wimbledon. There's only so many of those every year. And the UFC said, look, our pay-per-view is the biggest, best fights we're going to offer you, where usually the championships are. But our fight nights, the rest of our regular season. So the presentation changed, and then the lineups had to change. No longer was it every championship fight is the most important fight you watch this year. No longer was it every champion is the best fighter at that division in the world. Now it was, you got to know these fighters. You got to learn who they are. And that was difficult for some people to grasp. So when Ronda Rousey came along and Conor McGregor came around and John Jones was having his reign at the lightweight division, the UFC was trying to capitalize on this because they were trying to say, well, these are the biggest names in our sport. These are our Tom Brady's, Aaron Rodgers. This is our LeBron James, Joel Embiid. But by the end of the contract that the UFC had with Fox, because of the UFC's purchase by new ownership for $4 billion, the long-term future of the organization no longer lined up with Fox. And realistically, Fox didn't uphold their whole end of the bargain either. There were things that they promised the UFC they never fulfilled on. There were things that the UFC had promised that they would do that didn't always come to pass. And part of it was because Fox didn't really understand the deal that they were signing. And part of the problem for the UFC was they had a organization in Fox that, for all intents and purposes, was not as invested in the UFC as they had hoped. So when the opportunity for a new contract came up, the UFC looked at ESPN as an opportunity to not just grow their brand, not just give more exposure to their fighters, but to partner with a company that was going to take them to another level. And ESPN desperately needed content. When Jimmy Pitaro took over ESPN, he wanted to take ESPN away from the socio-political conversation. He wanted to take ESPN back to the sports roots. He wanted to make ESPN more about sports and less about the rest of the world. He wanted to make ESPN something that a wider variety of fans would come to and consume. And when you launch a platform like ESPN Plus, where you can watch all these exclusive games and events that you might not get on regular ESPN, ESPN2, there's only so many people who are going to download the app for women's softball or for soccer, any of these novelty niche sports that realistically had not gained a lot of traction. The NHL does not have the same traction and the same opportunities for growth that UFC and MMA does. Soccer has not gotten off the ground the way people had hoped. Despite the fact that WNBA has been around for a long time, it has a ceiling for its growth. It can only expand so much more. The UFC, with its multiple weight classes and men's and women's fights, and people from different cultures and backgrounds, is something that is much closer to football, much closer to basketball, than it is to soccer or to the NHL. Whereas some of these sports, like soccer, tennis, the NHL, you can't be in those leagues unless you come from a certain lifestyle, a different kind of background. You got to have some means or money or environment. You have to have grown up a certain way to have that kind of success. Almost anybody can become an NFL player. Almost anybody can become an NBA player. And in the same manner, almost anybody can become a UFC champion. So the appeal was wide-ranging. And for ESPN, they needed content for ESPN Plus. For ESPN, they needed to establish that when they are saying they're going to be more focused on sports, they had to give you more sports. And now Donald Cerrone, a guy who has fought for a very long time in the mixed martial arts world, a guy's taking one more run at trying to win a championship. He's getting exposure he's never had before. Exclusive interviews, Sports Center highlights. There's a focus now on the mixed martial arts world in a positive light that has never been given it before. And it's thanks to the UFC and ESPN partnership. Mixed martial arts was the last thing for ESPN to conquer programming-wise. The UFC was the only thing that had not broadcast on an ESPN platform yet. I mean, we've seen everything else. Major soccer games. We've seen the NBA, the NHL, Major League Baseball. We've seen playoff games. We've seen Little League World Series, the College World Series. We've seen almost every sport in the world covered in a big way by ESPN. Even the X Games, action sports, esports are even getting coverage on ESPN. But the UFC was the last thing. Do not be surprised if in a few years the UFC in mixed martial arts passes the NHL and passes soccer and passes a lot of other sports in this country and could potentially become at worst the number 4 sport and maybe even the number 3 sport if baseball stays stagnant. The appeal for this sport across culture, across gender, across economic class, across race, across every level, the UFC can give that to you. And ESPN is very invested in making sure that this product succeeds. Do not be surprised if in a few years, the UFC is the number 3 or 4 professional sports league in the United States. And it'll be because of this agreement with ESPN's exposure. No longer do you have to hope a star walks into the door like a Conor McGregor or a Ronda Rousey. You can create one like Henry Cejudo. You can create one like Donald Cerrone. And it is all because you have the power of ESPN with their exposure and their multiple platforms behind them. And you know the UFC is fully invested because they want to make sure that they get as much of a return on their investment in this deal as ESPN is investing in them. Topic number 4 on this episode of the Mutant Blitz Podcast, I wanted to do a rundown of the comic book themed movies that are coming out this year because I know that for a lot of people, a lot of this is new for you. You know, being exposed to characters you never heard of, or maybe you've heard very little of, you've never seen on a big screen before. And I wanted to give you an idea of what to look forward to, what is really going to be seen on the big screen, and how it relates in big picture to this ever-evolving storylines that are going on. Let's first start with Captain Marvel. Comes out March 8th in theaters. Captain Marvel is a very important movie in the evolving mythology of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It introduces you to a Kevin Feige, the head of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, has referred to as the most powerful character they've ever introduced. Captain Marvel takes place in the 1990s, so it's an era of the Marvel Cinematic Universe we've never seen before. And we know she has a major role, not just in the upcoming Avengers Endgame movie, but in all the Marvel movies beyond Endgame. Because remember, Endgame is also the end of a major part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe's history and is going to launch us into a new era of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And Captain Marvel is going to have a major part in that. You heard me talk about Shazam earlier. That comes out April 5th of this year. This is going to give fans an exposure to the more fun side of DC Comics, a more fun character, and a movie that's meant to stand on its own. We may or may not see a second Shazam movie, but we have been told that the Shazam movie is supposed to eventually set the groundwork for Shazam to be part of other movies moving forward. If there is going to be a second Justice League movie, if there is going to be other potential opportunities for crossovers, Shazam has been established and they can use him moving forward. April 26th is still the current release date for Avengers Endgame. I say current release date because Marvel has a history of changing some of these dates as we go along. We know that Avengers Endgame is going to be happening immediately after the events of Avengers Infinity War when Thanos snaps his fingers, and what we believe is that he eliminated half the life in the universe. Now, there's a lot of theories about what really or really didn't happen. Arguably the most ambitious movie that Marvel has done to date. Endgame was filmed at the same time as Infinity War, so there's been a lot of secrets about this movie. But whatever happens in the movie is going to set the groundwork for everything we see in Marvel moving forward. Because remember, with Marvel's purchase of Fox Studios, they are going to get X-Men, Fantastic Four, and a plethora of characters back into the fold. So with the potential of Tony Stark and Captain America exiting stage left, you have a new influx of characters coming in. It sets the stage for those characters to come in and not just have a major role in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but thrive as well. On June 7th, X-Men Dark Phoenix comes out. This is Fox Studios' second shot at trying to get the story of the Dark Phoenix with Jean Grey right. X-Men Last Stand was an absolute abomination. It was a movie that realistically was mishandled by everyone altogether. So this is another opportunity for Fox Studios and for Simon Kinberg and everybody involved to get it right. And this is also officially, as far as we know, the last movie by Fox of the X-Men characters. After this, X-Men are going to be rolled into the Marvel Cinematic Universe as far as we know. We also know that there's been no confirmation that any of the actors or actresses that are involved in the X-Men movies will be brought over. In fact, there's a lot of conjecture and a lot of rumors that the only characters to be brought over is going to be the Deadpool movies because of the extreme success Ryan Reynolds has had with that character. Outside of him, this is most likely the last chapter we will ever see of the major X-Men characters in this form. It's also an opportunity for Sophie Turner to really steal the big screen. She has a major role in this movie because Jean Grey being the Dark Phoenix is not just a very famous storyline, but it's a huge spotlight for an actress like Sophie Turner to really show the diversity of her acting chops, because the Dark Phoenix is more than just a character who has a lot of power. It's a character with a lot of layers. So we're going to find out exactly how deep of an actress she can be, while also finding out exactly how Fox wants to end their X-Men mega saga that has been now spanning 19 years since the first debut of the first X-Men movie with Patrick Stewart as Professor Charles Xavier and Ian McKellen as the infamous Magneto. We've come a long way since that movie, and this is going to be the final chapter in this ever-evolving saga by Fox in handling of the X-Men. On July 5th is Spider-Man Far From Home. This is the first movie post-Avengers Endgame for Marvel. This is an opportunity for Marvel to capitalize on whatever happens in Avengers Endgame and set the groundwork for everything moving forward. We know that Samuel L. Jackson has a major role in this movie, so that's another interesting tidbit to see how he's going to be involved in the Marvel Cinematic Universe moving forward. Jake Gyllenhaal is playing the villain Mysterio, so it'll be interesting to see what exactly his role is going to be in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There are hints about the potential Sinister Six for Spider-Man to deal with in a future movie. It'll be fascinating to see, because of the success of the first movie, Spider-Man's frequent appearances in other films, and Sony's desire to let Marvel keep making these Spider-Man movies, exactly what direction they're going to take the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a result of the Spider-Man movie. This movie was originally set to come out in the spring, but got moved to August, and that is New Mutants. It's a movie that's not been talked about a lot, and it really shouldn't. It's the introduction of some not very well-known X-Men mutants in a movie that looks more like a horror film than an actual drama, thriller, or action movie is the traditional film. This is where one of the reasons why Fox needs to not have mutants or any superheroes anymore. The movie looks like it's going to be an absolute disaster. I think it is cool that Colossus' sister, Ilya Rasputin, is going to be one of the main characters in the movie. But overall, the movie looks like it's going to be an absolute mess. This movie has been moved multiple times from different dates. You know, it was supposed to come out in 2018. It was supposed to come out in early 2019. Got moved up to the end of the summer of 2019. One of the reasons people say it got moved was because they said it wasn't scary enough. I can tell you right now, I will not be reviewing this on the podcast. This movie has no relevance to any other movie in the ongoing storylines in the Marvel or DC universes. This is one of the last movies Fox is going to ever make when it comes to these superheroes. If I were you, save your money. Don't go see this movie. If it comes out on demand and it's for free on one of the 200 platforms that you can watch movies, and you want to take a sit down, I would say make sure you have a cold one nearby, just in case you need to down a couple shots if this movie is worse than I expect. Finally, on October 4th, the movie Joker is coming out. This is a fascinating concept. Joaquin Phoenix being the Joker, telling a story of how the Joker became who he is. Robert De Niro's in the movie. a lot of interesting people are going to be a part of this movie. This is an interesting opportunity for DC to tell the origin story of the Joker that has never been done before. Remember, whether it's the comics, whether it's the animated shows, whether it's the movies, most people have very little information about the origin of the Joker, which leaves a lot of opportunity for creativity when it comes to telling this story. Because realistically, there's no defined origin for the Joker. It's not like Superman, well, Krypton's blown up and he lands in Kansas, or Batman where his parents are killed and he eventually grows up to become Batman. There's basically no agreement in the comic book world about the true origin of the Joker. So this is an opportunity for director Todd Phillips to tell a story that has not been told before. And because this movie is not connected to the rest of the DC universe, if it doesn't work out, if it's an origin movie that does not do well at the box office, it doesn't do well overall, then DC can just let it be and leave it alone. Or if it does do well, it can become another one of these movies that gets referenced by other movies. For example, The Incredible Hulk with Edward Norton as the Hulk is a movie that is not considered a part of the main chronology of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but is referenced in other movies. When Mark Ruffalo's Bruce Banner is talking about New York at one point, he says that he broke Harlem, that he's probably not a good idea if he goes back. That's a reference to The Incredible Hulk. The actor who played Thunderbolt Ross in The Incredible Hulk, he is brought back in later movies specifically for Captain America's Civil War. Also, some of the concepts about the Hulk, the reasoning, the rationalization for the Hulk, they're referenced in future Marvel movies. So even though that movie isn't a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a whole, it's referenced. DC can do the same thing with this movie. This movie does well when they have the new Batman coming out in the future. When they do future movies that may involve the Batman or the Joker or Gotham, and they want to reference something from this movie, they can do that. It doesn't mean this movie has to be part of the DC extended universe, but it can be something that allows for audiences who have already watched it and watch another DC movie to at least have something to reference in their minds when it comes to certain parts of the Joker and Batman mythos. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. If you have any thoughts on the content that we covered today on the podcast, you can drop it down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed my perspectives, hit that like button and subscribe to this YouTube channel so you catch each episode as we bring you my perspectives on the sports world as well as the comic book, movie, and television scene with yours truly, Josh Hennig, on the Mutant Blitz Podcast. Catch you next time.